What do I look for in a pair of reins? That's a question I hear all the time. I'm Nick Pernokas. I'm a custom saddle maker in Stephenville, Texas. And I thought I'd take a few minutes here just to talk a little bit about what goes into making a rein and what to look for when you're selecting reins. Nowadays, most rein widths and split reins, I'm talking about split reins here, most rein widths are 1/2 and 5/8 inch, those two sizes. Years ago, we did a lot of 3/4 inch. I even did some 1-inch reins. I've even made them a little bit wider than that, which seems pretty silly now. But today, people like a little narrower rein so it fits in their hand a little more comfortably. And most split reins are made from harness leather. And I have a pair here. This is a pair I made. The thing to know about reins is it's not the same leather. The harness leather isn't the same leather that you might get a belt made out of, or you might get your saddle made out of. It's a whole different type of leather, and it's tanned differently, and it puts more waxes and oils in it so that it's a little more resistant to moisture and sweat from your horse, and it also drapes a little better in your hand. It's not stiff, but on the other hand, you can't stamp it or emboss it like you can skirting or tooling leather. So it's a completely different type of leather. And when you look at a rein, what we try to do is we have the heaviest part of the hide that we use. The densest is down by the cattle's butt, and so that's the area that goes to your bridle bit when we strip them out. As you move up the side, the leather tapers down, and that's the place where your hand is, your hand hold. So that's the thinnest part of the rein. And then as you move to the tip or the pointed end of your reins that hang down, that comes out of the neck. Now that's the thickest part of the hide, and you may ask, why don't we put the thickest part of the hide down by the bridle? And I have done that, but it's a more inconsistent leather. It's not as dense. The pores are open more. There's more deformities in it. But it's really heavy. So it's not dense, but it's heavy. It's thicker. So it's a good balance point, because when you're selecting reins, you want them to hang in your hand, and you want the front that goes to the bit to balance with the part that hangs down off your horse, and that makes it more comfortable for your hand. If you have all your weight in the front and you don't have anything on the back, then you feel like all the weight's coming in the front of your hand and you don't have anything to balance it. You can't move your hand as easily either. When you're looking at reins for rein quality, you want something that's been edged and has a nice smooth edge, and that feels good in your hand too. You don't want anything that's real flaky, and you do want something that's been oiled. We oil our reins when we're done making them, and that gives them a little bit more suppleness. What I'd like to do is just show you what goes into making a pair of reins on this piece of scrap leather. This is actually the bottom of a rein side that I made reins from. I get the heaviest harness leather that I can buy, and it can vary from year to year depending on what types of hides are available on the market. But it's always the heaviest, graded the heaviest, extra heavy. And I use a draw gauge here to strip the reins out, but you might think we can strip a bunch of reins out and then pair them up. Every pair of reins is stripped out 2 at a time, and they're always kept next to each other. What we do is we draw a line somewhere on the side, and that line matches up with the line on both reins, so we always know where they were. Even if the sides are irregular, we keep the reins next to each other so that the balance is the same in both reins. I take this draw gauge, which is set at 5/8 inch, our most common type of reins, and I strip out a pair of reins. Again, this is a short scrap that I'm doing just to show you what it's like. In a side of leather like this, of harness leather, we might get 12 pairs of reins out. This leather is sold by the weight, so the heavier the leather, the more expensive it is. That's why the heavier reins are, the more you should expect to pay for them. You can see I've got to be very careful. I need a really sharp blade. Keep that cut the same. Okay, so I have 2 reins now, and I'm going to pair them up so that they're next to each other where that line is. Now most reins, I don't cut anything at less than 7 feet long, and most reins are 7 to 7.5 feet long for a reiner or any event where you don't drape your reins as much. 7.5 to 8 is very common for cutting horses where they want a little more drape, and Western pleasure horses. Again, it depends on the height of your horse too. You don't want an 8-foot rein if you're riding a 13-hand cutting horse. So I cut these to length. I try to use the most length I can. I get different side lengths of leather, and I use a longer side for longer reins just so I don't waste the leather. My line I drew is right here. These aren't exactly next to each other now because of the side being a little bit irregular on the end, so I cut them to length here, and then I'll do the same thing at the other end if this is a real pair of reins. After I have them the same length, I tip them, which means I put a pointed end on the neck end. And once I've done that, I label them what length they are on the tip with a letter. If they're L, they're long, 7.5 to 8. I can go over that. Again, it's not as popular now, but I've done reins as long as 9 feet, which is rare because you need a huge height for doing that. This is an edger, and that's what I use to take the edge off these. Now some factories run them through a machine that just does all this at one time, but it's hard with varying, as thick as the leather as we use, and it varies because it's thick at one end, thin, and then thick at the other. It's hard to run that through a machine, so we hand edge all of them, and we use this just to get the side off the corner around the edge so it feels good for your hand. We do this top and bottom, front and on both sides. You can see there are a lot of steps to making a simple piece of tack like this. And I'm doing a fast job here, just to demonstrate. Now some factories run this through a splitter, and the reins are the same thickness from the front to the back, and that's not really what I recommend for doing this. You don't get the balancing that I'm talking about. This is a rein that's one thickness all the way, and you can see it's just, this has happened to be a thin one, so it's not the same thing as far as the leather, but it's been leveled, and that makes it easier for running it through machines to make it, but you don't have the weight because they've leveled the ends to make it all the same weight. Once I have my rein edged like this, I wet the reins and I rub them with wax on the edges, like so. And there's a lot of elbow grease in this. That gives you a really smooth edge. It fills in all the pores on the edges of the leather, and it gives you a really nice edge. It feels good in your hand. When we're done with that, we take the reins and we have an oil vat outside. We coil them up and we dunk them in there briefly. You can't leave reins, and if you buy reins and try to oil them, don't leave them in the oil very long, because there's a point where the oil will just leach out for a year. You want to just get them in, get them covered, and then it takes a while for the oil to soak in. So that's what we do. They're all oiled when we ship them out. On the ends of these reins, you might notice the water ties. We use the same leather, and we just double it over and put a piece of lace leather through, and that's how you attach them to your bridle. It's an old Texas way of doing it. The advantage is that if a horse ever steps on the rein, you'll generally break the lace and not the rein. We do put buckles on for some people that like to buckle them instead of tie them, but the water ties is a traditional method, and that's what we do. And many people ask me, well, I'm getting a new headstall. Could you make the reins out of the same leather so they match? And that was popular at one time, but when you make a rein out of tooling leather, which you have to match a headstall, so it's got an orangey or a flesh color or a light, natural color, you take all the good parts out of making reins this way. They won't hang the same way. They won't have the drape, the feel. You won't be able to feel the bit as well through the skirting or the tooling leather, and it's never tanned to make reins. But you do many cheaper outlets use a matching process, and they use tooling leather when they do that. It'll be real light. It'll match their headstalls. You see that in feed stores many times. And those are the reins that you have for a couple of years, and then they just wear out or get cracked or whatever. So harness leather to me for a split rein is the only way to go. I hope you enjoyed this little bit we did on reins, and I'd like to thank the GHN for having me on here. I hope that if you liked it, you'll make sure you click like under the video. If you really like it, I hope you subscribe to the network so they can keep bringing you this kind of content. And if you have any questions at all, just put a comment underneath the video and I'm sure they'll relay it to me and I can give you a good answer. Or you can contact me at Pernokas Saddlery in Stephenville, Texas. Thanks for watching today.